the strategy that we are putting forward is the strategy that ultimately is going to work. It's best that we don't shoot first and aim later. It's important for us to get the strategy right, and the strategy that we are pursuing is the right one.
That was President Obama at the conclusion of his news conference yesterday at the G20 summit in Turkey. And joining us now from Paris is New York Times columnist Roger Cohen, who covers international affairs and diplomacy. In Washington, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and retired Lieutenant Colonel and Senior Fellow of the London Center for Policy Research, Tony Shaffer. Good to have you all on board. Senator Murphy, I'd like to start with you. There's a lot of concern and even criticism that the president's response was at the very least disengaged. What do you say to that?
Well, there's no doubt that we can do more, but I think the president is right to recognize that there is a limit to the potential of American military power in the region, that the reason that ISIS exists is in part because of 10 years of U.S. boots on the ground. And so, while I would argue for an intensification of airstrikes, and hopefully we'll have more European partners, I think that he's right to be fairly sober with the American people that this organization, this terrorist organization, was 10 years in the making. And so it's not going to be eliminated overnight, certainly not if there isn't some sort of political reconciliation on the ground. So, yeah, I think people may want to hear from the president a clearer determination to eliminate this threat, but I think he's right to be, I think, fair with the American people and Congress that this isn't going to happen overnight, and this can't happen unless we have real partners on the ground leading the effort in Iraq and Syria. That's where I think we can make some more progress, put some more heat on those guys.
Roger Cohen.
Where was that?
Roger Cohen, you're in Paris right now. Obviously, a lot of us read, and we're talking about your column immediately after the attacks. The senator says we do need a clearer message from the president, but not just for Americans, but also for the people of Paris. A lot of concern coming out of Europe. Talk about how his address was greeted in Paris.
Well, good morning. Yeah, viewed from a subdued and stunned and angry Paris, I would say that the president's words yesterday in Turkey felt very flat. It's all very well to say the strategy is working, but it doesn't look like it's working when 130 people have just been killed at random in clubs and restaurants and the streets of Paris. And it seems to me that after this, we got it wrong. We said that ISIS was a regional threat. It's not. It's a global threat. And to have ISIS controlling a wide area of territory in Syria and Iraq, where they can finance themselves through oil sales, where they can organize, where they can direct operations like this, and just say sometime in the future maybe we're going to resolve this. To me, that's not enough. We have to take that territory back, just as we resolved after 9/11 that it was unacceptable that Al-Qaeda have a safe haven in Afghanistan.
Lieutenant Colonel Shaffer,
yes, Joe.
What do we do? What do we learn from these attacks? How do we move forward more forcefully against ISIS?
Well, clearly there's a three-level threat here. We've got the regional threat as stipulated. We've got to retake this ungoverned space. Joe, we spoke about this briefly at CPAC earlier this year. There is a way of doing this in such a way to organize our allies into an Arab NATO, Shia helping Shia, Sunni helping Sunni, and that way we don't have our boots on the ground. We have to do that. We have to retake that space because the ungoverned space is stipulated is the cesspool for ISIS to grow from. We have to understand now that they have become expeditionary and they are going to be targeting soft targets. It's called asymmetric warfare. We saw this coming a year ago. And most importantly, Joe, the president's got to listen to his advisors in the Pentagon. General Dunford just came in. He's doing a bottom-up review of the strategy. Look, we have a lot of other options the president has before him. I can't talk about them all openly, but let me put it this way. President Obama continues, as you said earlier, puts up this straw man. Either it's 100,000 of our troops or nothing. He has other options. He has better options. He needs to listen to the advisors, which are giving him the best possible advice to protect the American people and walk back the ISIS threat. It can be done.
Senator Murphy, obviously, Dianne Feinstein, very concerned. Others on the Intel Committee, Republicans and Democrats alike, very concerned. It is not a regional threat. And you look at the fact that this is a terror organization that makes $50 million a month just on the black market with oil. And the ability to cause destruction and mayhem in Washington and New York and London, across the globe, is very high. We can't allow them, as the Colonel said, we can't allow them to continue to govern the space they're governing now, can we?
No, we can't, but I've heard those same options that are presented to the president from the military, and let's just be honest, none of them would lead to the defeat of ISIS by December or June of next year. All of those military options, none of which, of course, involve 100,000 troops or 50,000 troops on the ground, are still long-term efforts. None of them work without the government in Baghdad, the other Arab governments working alongside us. And yes, we have to be serious about the threat to the
Senator,
homeland.
what do we do, Senator? I mean, because we've been sitting around saying, and we've had people on this set for 2.5 years, 3 years, coming on this set saying, it's too hard, it's too complicated, and it's just, we can't do this and we can't do that. You've got cafes and concert halls shot up. You've got Washington as the next target.
We have a plane that
they say they're coming to America. A Russian plane blown out of the sky.
Canadian Parliament.
You look at what happened in Beirut. They are coming to us. 3.5 years. We may not have another 3 years to sit around and say, this is just too tough to figure out. So what do we do?
So, listen, I'm not being defeatist about it. What I'm suggesting is that you have a large number of Iraqis sitting outside of Ramadi right now that could take that city. But because the United States is not being tough enough on the Iraqis to force them to move, they're just sitting back. So we have not used the leverage that we have on the players on the ground to try to bring to an end this inevitability of the growth of the caliphate. So without American forces on the ground, there is absolutely more progress that we can make. But it's about finding new levers to put pressure on people like Abadi to actually move on ISIS in a way that they aren't today. Now, the U.S. has been doing it largely alone. Maybe now we will have some real partners in Europe. Maybe we will now have NATO at our back to try to make some progress. But the fact is, there's absolutely more we can do to take these guys out. But it's going to happen by using our military and political leverage in the region. And you know, in Syria, it's going to involve talking to the Iranians, talking to the Russians about a political solution, something that we haven't been willing to do.
Senator, Mike Barnicle, wasn't yesterday's moment when the president spoke, wasn't that the moment to call for that unity, international unity on this? Well, to reach out for them to work collectively with him?
You know, Roger Cohen wrote about this over the weekend, actually, calling for a NATO force to be implemented, Article 5 to be implemented. Roger, but let me ask you, well, two questions. Wouldn't part of invoking Article 5 and creating a NATO force just add fuel to the recruiting fever that ISIS employs within Europe? You've spent a large portion of your adult life in Europe. Isn't part of this something that is rarely mentioned by the president or by various politicians in this country, in that we are engaged in a generational war?
I think we are, and there's no perfect policy, but the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. These guys are ruthless terrorists. All the evidence is that they're pretty poor soldiers. Kurdish forces have made big advances against ISIS. There's a lot that we can do. We don't have to, as the colonel said, put 100,000 troops in. President Putin has troops on the ground. Why shouldn't we have troops on the ground? Why should Turkey be allowed to continue to have a porous border with ISIS through which ISIS is being aided and abetted? I hope President Obama spoke very firmly to President Erdogan about this. And I just think it is unacceptable, as I said, to allow this terrain to be held. If we are present on the ground, we can be part of the solution in Syria. President Putin has determined he has to be on the ground to be part of that solution. And to be the king of the slippery slope school of foreign policy, Bob Blackwell's phrase, as President Obama has been, is justified in a way, because we all know there have been failures and mistakes and big errors since 9/11. But to determine on the basis of that all forms of interventionism by the United States involving troops on the ground, boots on the ground, are doomed to failure, as the president seemed to say yesterday in Turkey, well, I just think that is very misguided and very dangerous for stability in the world, because what underwrites stability in the world still today is American power. And if people doubt that, we're in a very dangerous place.
The New York Times, Roger Cohen, Senator Chris Murphy, and retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, thank you very, very much. Coming up, we're going to